Hi there, my name is Ron Rogers, and this presentation is titled The Bizarre Tale of the Crash of Eastern Airlines Flight 401. Now, this is an interesting tale because it's one of the few accidents that actually has a very significant ghost story attached to it. This accident occurred December 29th, 1972. This was right at the beginning of my flying career because I soloed in July of 1972. And to remember much about this accident, you got to be kind of a dinosaur like me because it happened a long time ago. It happened before CLR was big in training. Now they attribute the accident to a burned out light bulb. They had a gear indication issue. This accident also resulted in cockpit resource management training, along with the United Airlines DC-8 accident up in Portland. Were emphasis for this, but this is a very unfortunate accident. It's attributed to pilot error, lack of situational awareness, but the issue where they thought they had it on autopilot and it came off autopilot was very insidious. But 101 people out of the total 176 died. 99 initially, two later. And this accident was a regularly scheduled flight from JFK down to Miami. And the accident occurred just before touchdown because that's when they lowered the gear to come into land. And it was almost midnight, and they lowered the landing gear and they didn't get three green. And that's when the problems started to develop. Now, the captain was a very senior individual at Eastern Airlines, Bob Loft. He was number 50 on the seniority list of Eastern, and he had 29,700 hours. So he was a very experienced captain. The co-pilot and the engineer were less experienced comparatively. The first officer was John Burt Stockstill, and the flight engineer, who is the purported ghost, was Repo, Don Lewis Repo. And in the movie that came out at NBC in 1978, that was made off of the book, it was played by Ernest Borgnine. He was the flight engineer. Now, this flight was routine until about 11:30 when they began their approach into Miami. They put the gear down, didn't get three green. They cycled it, still didn't get it. So they started to investigate the situation. Now, the crew basically, they went around because this was a situation where they needed time to investigate the whole situation. So they went around and they asked to enter a holding pattern, and they were given a climb to 2,000 feet. They're above the Everglades, and it's dark out there. It's absolutely dark at night. And they sent the second officer Repo down to the avionics bay to look through the gear viewing port to determine that the gear was actually down and locked, and it was down and locked. The whole situation was due to the fact that the light bulb had simply burned out, and they put it on autopilot, 2,000 feet, and for the first 80 seconds, the airplane maintained level flight. And then it in this process it dropped to 100 feet, flew again level there for 2 minutes, and then it began a gradual descent. It was so gradual that it wasn't perceived by the crew. Now, an interesting aspect is that this airplane had the standard altitude warning system where you had a C chime, a chime that went off and indicated that they had departed the altitude, but apparently nobody was monitoring that, and nobody was, nobody heard the chime go off. They were too busy with the other aspects, and nobody actually was in total command of flying the aircraft. Now, what they suspect happened was the airplane was on autopilot, but when the captain leaned forward to talk to the engineer, he put a little bit of pressure on the yoke, and it was just enough pressure on the yoke to take it off of autopilot altitude hold and put it into what's known as control wheel steering, CWS. And this is where that you put inputs into the control column, and the autopilot maintains those inputs. So if you put the nose down, it maintains the nose in that pitch attitude. You put it up, it maintains the nose in that pitch attitude, correcting for thrust, airspeed, and things like that. But apparently they had pushed the autopilot forward, and apparently there was no autopilot warning that it had degraded into this condition, or at least no indication that they were aware of. And they had done the one turn, as you see in the depiction here, and as they started the second 180-degree turn, there was the following conversation in the cockpit. Stockstill, who is the co-pilot, said, "We did something to the altitude." The captain says, "What?" And the co-pilot says, "We're still at 2,000 feet, right?" The captain says, "Hey, what's happening here?" That was 10 seconds before the impact. And it was a very gradual impact. They hit the ground 18.7 miles from 9 left there at Miami. They're doing 227 miles per hour, 197 knots, and they were in a left turn. The left wingtip hit first. The airplane actually went about 500 feet before the fuselage actually began to hit and break up. Now, all in all, 75 people survived the crash. 67 of the 163 passengers and 8 of the flight attendants. The flight engineer was the only one who, out of the cockpit crew, survived, interestingly enough. The flight attendants, in spite of being injured, actually gave quite a bit aid to the passengers. And one thing that compounded their injuries was the fact that the flight attendant stations at this time were not required to have shoulder harnesses. So they only had the lap belt, so they were not as well secured as they should have been. And also, remember, this was at night, total darkness in the Everglades, and they did not have the flashlight next to the flight attendant stations, so that would have aided. And the flight attendants were credited as being very helpful and brave in this. They stopped people from lighting cigarettes that had survived standing around the wreckage. There were some airboat people that came in and were very helpful in helping with the survivors. The mud actually was credited with preventing a number of people from bleeding out, although they got a lot of infections from being in the swampy mud. But the flight attendants were very helpful, and they stopped certain passengers from lighting cigarettes. Yeah, they had all this aviation fuel around. The aircraft didn't burn on impact. They just had all this aviation fuel spread around. And like the great Waldo Pepper, you don't want people to start lighting cigarettes and catching the accident scene on fire. And that would have been a big disaster if they would have caught the jet fuel on fire. So they prevented that. And Frank Borman, former NASA astronaut, and he was the Eastern Senior Vice President. He chartered a helicopter and went out to the crash scene. Now, it's interesting. Most of the dead passengers were in the aircraft's midsection, which is usually considered to be more one of the more stronger parts of the aircraft. And a lot of those people, unfortunately, died. Now, shortly after this, rumors of ghost sightings started to appear. There were sightings of both the captain, Robert Loft, and the flight engineer, Don Repo. And there were sightings aboard other L-1011 aircraft. The rumor is that they used recovered parts off of the crashed aircraft, November 310 EA, and they put them on other aircraft, and one of those other aircraft was a L-1011 318. And as the book talks about, the movie talks about, they cited the engineer, I guess the captain also, but the book mainly talked about citing the engineer on the aircraft. And supposedly these ghost sightings occurred until the parts were removed. Now, it's kind of interesting. Eastern Airlines didn't like the publicity at all, and they threatened the crew members. They said, hey, if you tell anybody that you saw a ghost, you can be fired. So that didn't go over quite very well. Now, John Fuller wrote the book in 1976, The Ghost of Flight 401, and I was actually I was in a fighter unit. We were going down to Savannah, Georgia, down to the range down there, and I was stationed at Cleveland, and I flew Eastern Airlines flight from Cleveland down to Atlanta, and then I went over to Savannah. And on the way down, a young lady came down, sat next to me. Now, this is one of the things where you're sitting in the seat, and this beautiful young lady is coming down the aisle there, and you're going, "Oh, please let her sit next to me. We can have a fun, nice discussion." Now, this is a slight digression here, but I think it's kind of an interesting story because she comes down, she sits next to me, and I know most of my people who watch this are Americans, and you know how Americans are. They'll sit down next to a stranger, and 20 seconds later, you'll know their life story. Well, she sits down next to me, and I guess she had been stationed. She came actually from a very prominent family, and she had worked at a car rental agency there in the airport. And she had started a relationship with a gentleman who she later realized was married. And she threatened to, she's telling me this story, she threatened to inform his wife, and he proceeded to physically injure her. And in fact, she showed me, she said she could see through the makeup her black eye. She had been sent up basically by her family to Cleveland with an aunt to kind of wait this thing out, let the storm go over. It was very big embarrassment to the family. So that was her story going on down. And on the way back, I am coming back, and I get to Atlanta very early in the morning. I'm sitting in the Eastern Terminal waiting for my flight, and I am actually reading this book, The Ghost of Flight 401. This was in the early 80s when I was in the unit. The book was written in 76. I'm reading the book, and I'm looking up, and I see an L-1011 sitting there. And it's nose number 318, one of the ghost sightings aircraft. And, well, okay, security was different back then. It must have been, because I'm sitting there virtually alone in the boarding area, and the jetway is connected to the aircraft. The jetway door is open. The aircraft door is open. I could have walked right onto the airplane with nobody at all stopping me. There were a few, I think, maintenance people wandering around, but that was just a little strange. Okay, I digress there. Now, the thing about this book, Frank Borman, he said you'll be fired if you say you saw a ghost, and he called the whole ghost story rubbish. The captain's wife sued the author, John Fuller, saying it infringed with the captain's right of privacy and invasion of his privacy and inflicted emotional distress and stuff like that. It was interesting. John Fuller also wrote another book, and this is talking about the British R-101 dirigible. Now, there was and this is a ghost story too, which is rather interesting because I actually talked to a crew member on one of these series of dirigibles, not this one because it crashed on its maiden flight, but talking to one of these people who was familiar with this ghost story that goes back to dirigibles. So, okay, you guys who say I'm covering old accidents, okay, this is when I start talking about dirigibles, I'm really getting back there. Okay, but the deal on this one, there was a World War II ace called Captain Raymond Hinchcliffe, and he had his flamboyant passenger, heiress actress Elsie McKay, and they vanished in the Atlantic. Well, this was back in the 1930s, and there was a big spiritualism movement both in the United States and abroad. It wasn't uncommon at all to have seances and things like that. So apparently, during one of the seances, this World War I ace, Hinchcliffe, appeared and warned that there were extremely important structural defects in the dirigible, the R-101. And he warned people not to fly. Well, they ignored him, and the aircraft took off, and it crashed on the French side of the English Channel, killing all but 6 of the 54 passengers. And interesting thing after that, the captain of the dirigible who was flying the R-101 appears in ghost stories, appears in seances telling his story about of the airplane going down. So that's the tale of Eastern Airlines Flight 401. That was an issue where they had a very minor problem, just a burnt out light bulb, and nobody was flying the aircraft, although they were at a low altitude and the indications were rather subtle. They thought it was on autopilot. They thought they were under control. I mean, that's fairly reasonable, but you still have to dedicate. I mean, that's what comes out of these accidents. You learn to dedicate one crew member to fly the airplane, because that's the most important thing in any emergency checklist is fly the airplane. And that was part of the problem back here. So it's a rather interesting accident. It brings to light crew issues and crew management issues that are now a very important part of training. But the bizarre part of this whole thing, anybody who remembers this era, was the ghost stories, the movies, and the books. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this a little bit interesting, if not unusual and off the wall, but I think it's a good story. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it.